If your yard has existing grass or vegetation present, you must remove it before adding the subbase material.
Spray the soil with a weed killer such as Roundup or Ground Clear. Install landscape fabric and attach the landscape staples. Spread the subbase material evenly throughout the entire surface with a landscaper's rake. Use the finger side of the rake to move large amounts of subbase and the flat side of the rake to smooth out the crusher fines. Repeat this process at several different angles until the surface is free of small bumps and ridges. When you're completely satisfied with the smoothness of the surface, use your garden hose and spray nozzle to dampen the area. A plate compactor compacts and levels the surface area. Tamp the edges with a hand tamper as a final touch to the edges. Lightly wet the area one more time. Fill your water-filled sod roller with water and roll across the dampened subbase several times. Remove the salvage edges off the sides of the turf by rolling the turf back a couple of feet. Adjust the turf to line up the seams. Get each piece as close as possible to one another without overlapping the turf. You may need to kick out any of the loose turf or big wrinkles. Inspect the seam gap one more time before adding the seam tape. Make sure that the pieces of turf are not overlapping one another. A 1/16 inch gap between the two pieces of turf is ideal. Insert border stakes down the seam approximately 6 foot apart before you roll back both pieces of turf. This gives you a true center for the seam tape. As you're unrolling the seam tape, remove the border stakes and then reinsert over the seam tape, which keeps the seam tape in place. The first piece of turf rolled onto the seam tape should be the one that has the least amount of fibers overlapping the edges. This prevents the fibers from contacting the seam tape. Now slowly unroll that piece of turf onto the seam tape. Remove the border stakes from the seam tape. Without unrolling the entire piece of turf onto the seam tape, start at one end and adjoin the two pieces of turf as close together as possible without overlapping. If you notice a sizable gap, use a carpet seam repair tool to pull the two pieces of turf closer to narrow the gap. If you don't have a carpet seam repair tool, you can drive two border stakes in at a 45-degree angle about halfway down, and then pull the two border stakes upright. This will stretch the turf into place. In the event the turf overlaps, you can gently kick the turf away from the seam. You should do this on both sides of the seam. Insert landscape staples across the seam every 1 foot along the entire seam. To ensure that you don't bury the fibers, don't pound the staples all the way down until you pick the turf fibers out. Sometimes landscape staples aren't sturdy enough to penetrate rocky soils. If this is the case, we recommend using border stakes on each side of the seam instead. Now walk the seam line with short steps to ensure seam tape adhesion throughout. Power broom the turf against the grain in a back and forth motion as shown here.
If you don't have a power broom, use our stiff bristle broom to fluff up the fibers. Hold the broom handle belt level and walk against the grain of the turf multiple times.
Watch and learn these useful cutting methods. Cutting short relief cuts makes it easier when cutting on the back side of the turf. Stake the borders, spacing the stakes 1 to 2 feet apart. For areas used by dogs, we recommend spacing the stakes approximately 6 inches apart. Be sure not to bury the head of the stake without picking the fibers away before pounding the stake all the way in. Infill acts as a ballast to hold the turf in place, helps keep fibers upright, provides cushion, and deodorizes. The most economical infill applications are all sand. 20 mesh silica sand is best, but very difficult to attain, so the most popular is clean, bagged play sand. Go back and forth with your drop spreader a couple of times on the same path before moving over to the next path. Alternate using the power broom in between each few passes of infill spreading. This prevents the fibers from getting buried and keeps the fibers standing erect. The edges may need extra attention. Use the leaf blower and power broom to level out the infill. Now rinse the turf, which will settle the infill and clean the dust off.